Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Barry Merrick. I'm founder and CEO at Ivy, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you today to Anne Hiatt. Anne, welcome. How are you today?
I'm great, Barry. Really happy to be here.
So good to have you. I'm incredibly excited to dive into our conversation on how all of us can become masters at betting on ourselves, how we can recognize, own, and implement breakthrough opportunities. To dive straight in here, want to ask you the vision that uniquely drives you, right? Through your career, through this amazing new book that you just wrote, Bet on Yourself. Share with us what's the ultimate change you're looking to make in the world and what that would look like if it came true.
I am really looking to both discover and empower entrepreneurs. I think step one to that is helping people identify themselves as entrepreneurs. So a lot of the leaders listening here might recognize wanting to create a culture of intrapreneurs. And so that really starts with having these best practices and this mindset of thinking like an owner be pervasive throughout our organizations and our networks. And I would consider it a huge success if I could translate the best practices of the CEOs that I've worked for and transmit that into as many minds as possible and create these future leaders.
Brilliant. So as you know, in our audience, we have an incredible group of CEOs as well as rising leaders on their teams. We all want to be the best version of ourselves, but at the same time, we want to create the environments for others to truly thrive and flourish. And to just get your view on this, right? We all want the same things. There's been thousands, tens of thousands of books written on how to better manage yourself, better lead, and so on. Despite all of this, what do you believe are the biggest mistakes that leaders are making when it comes to the framework you've created on betting on yourself? Like otherwise super smart individuals who have the best intentions, what are the most common mistakes you see them making, whether they're the CEO or a rising leader?
Two things come immediately to mind. The first is being tempted to park yourself in a conference room or now on Zoom for 15 hours a day without giving yourself time for reflection. The act of leading actually is in those moments when you're between commitments. And a lot of my CEO clients that I'm seeing right now are tempted to have their schedule just back to back. So I think mistake number one that I see across the board, across all 5 continents that my clients are on, is overscheduling, not giving yourself time for thought work. That's a best practice I learned both from Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt, who were very, very thoughtful in the way they did it. The second one that comes to mind is really about gathering the right team around you, making sure. I often see that there's, especially if you have people who started with you as a startup and you're going into a scale up and big impact, some of those people don't follow the same growth curve as the success of your company. And so making sure that your leadership team makes you your best self. And that really is about getting people in there who challenge your ideas, who keep you accountable. The danger zone I see is once I see a leadership team that thinks all your jokes are funny and all your ideas are good, you're on the path for destruction.
All right, got it. So we got to avoid this overscheduling, not enough time for reflection, as well as really be honest about who's surrounding us to push us to be our best selves. You worked with Jeff Bezos, I guess, like an earlier version, maybe a 1.0 or something like that. And then for many years, you were at Google, you were chief of staff to Eric Schmidt. If you were to really take a look at these two individuals and their peers, these like superstars, almost mythical leaders of these like some of the most successful organization humanity has ever seen, what would you say are like the most critical qualities that led to their success? So let's start maybe with the universals, right? Despite their different personalities and so on, what's like table stakes? What are the qualities they both had and their peers? And then we can go into also the differences between them. But let's start with what are the commonalities? What are table stakes we all need to keep in mind when it comes to aspiring to be that good?
Yeah. I've teased my first 2 answers with your first question, which is really about being very, very careful who you assemble around you. And I learned from Jeff Bezos, actually in hiring my replacement when I left after 3 years of working for him, he rejected like what felt like thousands of candidates after me. So lesson number 1 is keep that bar really, really high, especially when you're tempted with that feeling of, I just got to get people in the seats. We're growing so fast. I don't have time to be choosy. That's exactly when you need to be choosy. And Jeff Bezos told me a line I've repeated to myself in every interview since then. He said, I will only hire people I have to hold back, not push forward. That means your energy as a leader is honing their passion alignment with what you're doing and spending all your time just giving that a direction instead of incentivizing, pushing them, checking in. The energy exchange is very, very different. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. The second best practice is giving yourself some space to be very thoughtful about what's coming around. I kind of teased that in my first answer, but a common practice among all of the super performers I worked with and around is protecting at all costs their time to be thoughtful and reflective. Jeff Bezos did this every single quarter. He would take a 1-week thinking retreat. Now, not all of us have the luxury to do that, but I want to challenge you right now. You might think I could never. But remember, I'm talking about early 1.0 Jeff Bezos. This is 2002. He had been Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1999. By the time I joined in 2002, the board was considering bringing in a professional CEO because they weren't sure his vision was going to translate into profit. But in those critical moments when he was most under the microscope is when he would step away, be reflective, and come back with those solutions. Much better value exchange than if he'd been in a conference room the whole time.
Brilliant. So above and beyond this building the great teams, giving yourself the strategic reflection space, what other qualities would you say are table stakes that you've observed in these individuals and their peers?
The third one that comes to mind is an attitude. I love the way Satya Nadella explained it when he was trying to turn around the culture at Microsoft, something I personally thought was impossible. I grew up in Redmond, Washington. My family moved there in 1985. I watched this personal computing revolution build quite literally around my parents' house. Satya Nadella calls this culture shift one from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. I absolutely see the top performing CEOs remain insatiably curious. And that especially extends outside their area of expertise. If you're in fintech, I'm not talking about just diving into finance and those things. I'm talking about things that seemingly have nothing to do with your day-to-day. It inspires new ideas. This is how you engineer a little bit of serendipity and luck. You've heard these different conversations. You're outside the bubble of people who think just like you or come from similar backgrounds or philosophies. And that I see as a commonality in truly innovative thinking when you're seeking out dissenting opinions or experiences far different from your own. So that would be my number 3.
Excellent. What about the fact that, there's such a almost like a natural tendency, especially as organizations get larger, there is a leaning towards, people just like, hey, like we've been successful for certain reasons. Don't try to mess it all up. Don't try to change everything. So there's a bit of a headwind sometimes when it comes to driving change. And also, though, whenever we look to drive change, there's tremendous risks associated, right?
Sure.
The more change you push for it, higher the reward, but also higher the potential downside if it doesn't work out. Share with us what these greats have in common when it comes to being willing to get very uncomfortable, making other people uncomfortable, and how they navigate that, like the approach to innovation and the approach to risk-taking, approach to failure.
Yeah, I think one of the best answers I've seen on this topic, which is an ever-evolving and terrifying decision to make as a leader, I actually saw the best answer given by Pablo Rodriguez. He is now working at Google X in the Moonshots factory. And Pablo Rodriguez described this as, you want to, at the moment, you've got 70% of your resources, your time, your energy, your employees, your bets, in the 70% of the core structure of your company. Google's famous for having that 20% time where if you've hired really well, you can trust those people to work on new and innovative things that are pushing the envelope a bit. What you want to do is make sure that you've got 10%, that remaining 10%, for these moonshots, these crazy things that don't seem directly connected to what you're doing right now, and make sure that they are measured very differently. They don't have those same KPI deliverables. These are your big crazy bets. Because in the future, Pablo points out, it flip-flops. That 10% is your future 70% core business. But if you're not investing on what seems to be on the outskirts of your core bet, that's when you become prime for disruption. So I know it feels really scary, but I think I really liked his answer on that. And I think that is the right balance of keeping that core structure there, but making sure you're constantly challenging your favorite ideas.
And when things don't work out, inevitably, right? There's no way everyone hits a home run every single
No.
time. So to think that, a board was thinking of replacing Jeff Bezos, right? Seems now crazy in retrospect.
Yeah.
Share with us how you've seen these individuals react when things actually get tough, when things don't work out, where there's questions about their, viability, either because they're too risk-taking or too conservative in their approach compared to expectations from their teams or their investors. How have you seen them deal with setbacks?
One of the common traits that I see in these high performers is doing what we call postmortems, of really getting very, very honest about what happened. Never trying to cover it up or sweep it under the rug, never trying to sugarcoat it or use language, because it is a common mistake, and it's well-intentioned. You don't want to scare your employees. You want them to feel like you know where you're going, you know exactly what happened. So you do want to lead with authority. But what I've actually found, especially in the pandemic, is your employees really respond well when they see you being vulnerable. You say, we made an educated bet here. Here are the premises upon which that bet was made. This is what happened. We reversed engineer it. And now we see here was a missing piece. We're using that information now to make a more educated guess for how we're going to pivot. So I think it's not only what happened, but why, and trusting them enough to be part of the process. Jeff Bezos calls it showing the math. In that instance I was talking about, of when they were literally considering removing him as CEO, it was when he had proposed what is now Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime now is obviously the cash cow, but they really had very, very big concerns about how they could turn it around. And he went into that board meeting knowing his job was on the line, and he literally did the math. He showed them just that. This is the premise upon which I'm building it. This is the bet I'm making. This is the result I'm doing. And here are the performance indicators I will be watching for, so I can see if it's going off the rails before we totally lose the farm. I think that shows a lot of maturity, and you get a longer leash, and you get a lot of more trust, both from your board and your employees, when you're really open that way.
Excellent. Thank you for that. If you were to share, when I reflect on all the great individuals who were, reached the top of their game, achieved the level of mastery, I do always wonder between the balance of to what extent does their vision play a key role, to what extent is it their perseverance and just raw hard work, outworking everyone, and then how much is it actually about their conviction? So they so deeply believe in something that doesn't matter, what else happens, they can keep adapting because they've got a clear North Star. Could you just share a little bit about the role of those three things individually: the vision, the perseverance, and the conviction?
I mean, I think you've identified the secret sauce. Those absolutely are core elements to success. If I had to pick one to be the most important, I would choose resilience. And in fact, if you right now Google relentless.com, it redirects you to Amazon, because Jeff wanted that to be the core part from day one of how we made decisions. And being relentless isn't about being stubbornly stuck in your ideas and just having to prove your point no matter what. Relentlessness is about questioning your ideas, pivoting really fast, running faster and harder. And yes, then comes, you have to, in order for relentlessness to pay off, you have to have the right vision. But in that process of being relentless, it's about taking information, seeing how it works, looking at the data, pivoting accordingly, and then shifting your vision accordingly. One of the greatest privileges for me right now, honestly, and I left Amazon almost 15 years ago, is I see now things that Jeff wrote in his vision books back then. That kind of long-term decision-making, while he's very much focused on delivering today, that vision is why Amazon is so pervasive today.
So let's talk about the opposite of, what you just said, which is we all have it, right? No matter how strong our vision, conviction, hard work, all that, there are doubts, right? Because you have your vision, and then, reality punches you in the face, telling you not necessarily your vision is wrong, but what you just tried to do, not working, right? You got to adapt and so on. So your book is called Bet on Yourself, right? And if it was, so easy to do, you probably wouldn't have written the book. Right. So tell us about the role of doubt. So what is it that really precludes people from properly betting? What prevents them from really betting on themselves, right? When people like, let's say, Bezos, Eric Schmidt, like, I mean, they really bet on themselves, but like, how did they deal with doubt? Because certainly they must have it. What's the key lesson we can learn from that?
Doubt is absolutely part of it. Even when you're sure of your vision, even when you're putting everything in that basket and everyone else disagrees with you, doubt is an important element, actually. I wouldn't lean away from that. When you feel that moment of doubt, don't allow it to derail your motivation or your confidence, but take it as an indicator of, do I have the right data here? Is this a sixth sense that I'm having about something that hasn't been scrutinized enough? This is actually the reason why Jeff created the process that is now famous, the 6-page memos, because he wanted to take an academic approach to his decision-making. He had this vision that no one else in the world had, but what he needed to do was to be very, very specific in the data he was gathering, being intentional about the premises upon which you're basing it. So when he felt, as all companies do in that scale-up stage where all your old systems start breaking, you can figure out why. You'd be like, oh, because it was premised on this, and that has since changed, and you can pivot its decision making. So I would lean into it. One anecdote that I have of Eric Schmidt is that he came off stage just having given a brand new speech, and he said to me with such sincerity, "Was that okay? Was that speech all right?" I mean, he really meant it. I put my notebook of feedback down because I knew he was going to ask me how it went, and I just said, "You're Eric Schmidt. Like, of course that was okay." And he laughed a little and he said, "I still have to remind myself I'm not little Eric from Virginia anymore." This was in 2017. This is not beginning of his career. So I want you to know that those feelings qualify you to be in the ranks of some of the most effective CEOs. And so I would lean into those moments rather than let it deter you as a chink in your armor.
So let's actually connect the dots between that point, the point you made about humility, the point you made about be a learn-it-all rather than a know-it-all, or encourage your team to do the same. What's that secret sauce of, like, are some people just born with both extremely strong convictions and visions and work ethic and extremely strong ability to have this like curiosity, which oftentimes is a sign of also massive intellectual humility, like the belief that you can always learn something new in any random conversation with any random person? Is that something that can be cultivated, or is it just like one of these things where like you can succeed to a great level to one degree? I mean, Jim Collins is like level 5 leadership. Most people, I mean, most great leaders get to level 4, but like they don't graduate to level 5 because the degree of humility just isn't there.
Yeah.
But is that just like, okay, just you're either like that or not? Or have you seen like practices that really cultivate that sense of humility so that like hubris and insensitivity as you get more powerful doesn't block your path?
Yeah, it is really hard. I mean, there's no question that the upper echelons of truly effective leadership is really hard to get to. I do think that you can battle your nature. Like, this goes back to that nature nurture question, right? I do think that the people I worked for, Jeff Bezos, Marissa Mayer, Eric Schmidt, the many cast of characters that were in our orbit, they are exceptional and they were probably born that way. However, I have absolutely seen them cultivate that in their leadership teams, teach those traits, myself included. I am a natural perfectionist in the way that I massively inhibited myself out of fear of looking stupid in front of people whose opinions I cared about not doing something perfectly. I didn't even want to try, because if I didn't try, it goes back to Carol Dweck's work around mindset. Reading her book literally changed my life as a young person. So what you can cultivate it. And I think you pointed out the most important element, which is humility. Leaders can create a space of psychological safety where they can challenge and be challenged and set the pattern for that behavior. When I was brand new at Amazon in 2002, I was 20 years old, my first job, I had no idea what I was doing. I had a major catastrophe happen in the beginning of my career there. Could have derailed me and been the end. But instead, Jeff, his reaction to it was, you're really good under pressure. You asked the right questions, you pivoted to the right solution, and you gathered the right experts around you. So in that example, instead of berating me and being upset or firing me even, he taught me, you can trust your instincts. At least you ask the right questions. And so I think you can cultivate that in your leaders around you. Doing it for yourself is tough. That's why I said number one tip is surround yourself with the highest quality people you can possibly find who keep you accountable and honest with yourself and continue to disrupt. But I think it can be taught. I really do.
All right, excellent. So you gave us so many key ingredients to the recipe of, how to bet on yourself and how to, kind of set yourself up for success by building great teams, having that reflexivity, be a learn-it-all, take risks, be transparent with your failures, resilience, and like that doubt and humility, and how to have all of that. Now, what I'd like to do is, let's say these are our like top-down, strategically, these are things we got to cultivate throughout our lives based on what you shared. Let's now look at it more bottoms up, tactical, every day. So how do we live our lives, right? And what are the key routines and best practices we can implement to make sure that like there's a limit to how far we can go off the rails when it comes to these things? So how can we create the kind of routines and like, I guess like the bumpers, right? When you go bowling, like that keeps you on track, right? Because obviously we're human, things get emotional, we lose perspective often, and we need to get back to reality and objectivity. So let's take this from the perspective of a day in the life of, right? So what did Jeff Bezos, what did Eric Schmidt, what were their daily practices that really enabled them to stay on track? And let's just take it from a purely an individual perspective for now. Then we can do the more, okay, and then what can we implement team-wide? But let's start, first of all, personal practices that really help to do all this.
Yeah, I think in this element, it's really interesting to use them as individual case studies because they are very different in personality, but very similar in their output. So with Jeff Bezos, for example, he would wake up very early in the morning, often 5 or 6 a.m., and he would work out. He had a treadmill in the middle of his library in his house. And so it starts with one, fueling yourself, taking good care of your physical body and stimulating your mind. So after his workout, he would read minimum for an hour. He came in every morning into the office with 3 newspapers having been read, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Seattle Times, and then inevitably another article or book. He was always reading. He would come in and we had patterns to the week to give a good workflow. So Mondays were senior strategy meetings, Tuesdays were product focus, etc. So he could stay in one gear. We lose so much efficiency when you're constantly shifting gears from like one-on-ones and strategy and then to finance and the CFO. If you can get each day to be in a single gear, you're much more efficient and you really get into that flow state much easier. So depending on the day, we would assemble the usual teams and had some routine. Jeff in particular, he would use those 6-page memos I referenced before. Great read, if you haven't read it yet, is a book by Colin Breyer and I can't remember the second author, called Working Backwards. Amazing. It shares all the best practices. But Jeff would start each meeting with everyone heads down reading that briefing, that 6-page memo, so everyone had the same data. And the meetings were never used to give what he called a weather report. It was always for debate. If we had agreement, there's no reason for us to be in the room together. So that time was to challenge each other's ideas and keep each other really honest. And then the end of the day was usually used for his reflection. This is another thing I see not enough leaders doing, is at the end of the day, or ideally between meetings, is to reflect what went really well about that, what was missing, what could be improved, and what ideas were created from that. Other people are tracking action items and stuff, but your job as the leader in that room is to be reflective and carry those reactions and take away in the data you just received, and then use a vision to create an action plan from that.
So just that last piece, give us the very specifics of like, how did he actually do that reflection? So 1, he made time for it, great. Yeah. And then 2, you said he noted what went wrong, what could be better, new ideas. Like, but are those like, did he have literally, he just answers those questions about each meeting, or is it about each day? And then once he does do that, then what? Who does he send it to? Because probably he's not also the same person who's going to then work on all of this. So what was that? I guess that's where you came from.
He would give it to me. So yes, on those briefing documents, on that 6-page memo for each meeting, he would have his notes from the meeting. So at the end of the day, he would reflect. And at the top of each of those memos, it wasn't necessarily like 1, 2, and 3 like that, but that was just the pattern I recognized, having read a million of those over the 3 years, is he would answer those questions. Then he would hand it to me. And on those notes were the action items, the follow-up, and we will create the action log. And then at the time, my boss was John Connors, who is Jeff's chief of staff, still is today, 19 years later. John Connors, then his responsibilities were tracking those action items, making sure the vice presidents, the senior vice presidents had all the resources they need in order to deliver that, because it was always doing something that no one had ever done before. So his job was to anticipate, how can I set this team up for success? And then the most important part was Jeff would then turn to his vision books. He always had a Moleskine notebook in his back pocket, always, probably still does. And he would then translate, after he'd done all those notes for the individual meetings, he would then write in that notebook the overall themes or ideas that inspired, sometimes seemingly disconnected things that had popped into his mind that day that had been inspired by the conversations. And he regularly revisited and tracked those notebooks to look for patterns, best practices, and things he wanted to implement.
All right, brilliant. So for all of us, I guess the critical action item here is like, 1, do we have that space to reflect? 2, are we systematic about, really going through what worked, what didn't, key themes? And then 3, which was implied in what you said, Anne, is like, do you have the people around you that can actually help you take action?
Yeah.
Because obviously there's trade-offs between how often are you in the meetings, how often are you reflecting, and how often are you executing on your own ideas? And as you get more senior, the amount of time you have doesn't really grow. No. So having people like you, Anne, by his side, I'm sure it made a huge difference. Before we move to Eric Schmidt, who, as he said, is quite different in his approach, let's also reflect on, you told us the average day in the life of Jeff Bezos, right? That's like everything is fine. But that's probably not the day that, he was worried about, like, oh my goodness, what if we run out of cash? Or what if all the investors? So tell us about more like catastrophic days, how you've seen them behave, how you've seen him behave, and then we'll go to Eric. Like really bad news, really unusual day. And also really good news, spectacular. Now he's the richest man in the world. I mean, you weren't there when that happened, but like, like big wins. So how did he react to the extremes? Like as part of like, deviating from that daily routine when there was alarm bells going off or champagne popping? How did you see him handle those, his approach to those kinds of out of the usual days?
Catastrophic bad days, you knew it immediately. Jeff is loud in both his boisterous laugh and also when he's upset. So in fact, we were in a single building, there was 15 floors. I never had to wonder where he was. I would just go to the stairwell and I could hear him no matter what room he was in. He was just a loud guy. So you knew when you disappointed him. And that's one of the things that I learned to appreciate the most is you always know exactly where you stand with him. He's never going to sugarcoat something. If he's mistake, he will also tell you that idea is dumb. Like, I don't agree. But he also wants you to push back. He wants you to defend it. And most importantly, he wants data to back it up. So if we're doing a postmortem in front of Jeff Bezos, 1, he clears the deck because he is not going to time constrain this conversation. He doesn't care what interview you had or what next meeting you have to go to. If something is that important and key to the strategy or the success or the survival of the company, we clear the decks. We need that kind of creative problem solving needs space, and you can't do that in artificial constraint. So 1, super clear with what missed his expectations. 2, we went immediately to the data. And 3, we gave it the time it needed to be properly resolved rather than putting a Band-Aid on it or just giving your first idea that popped into your mind while you're being yelled at by Jeff. We're gonna take the time to get to an actual solution that everyone feels is the right approach. On the wonderful days, equally loud. He's very boisterous. He celebrates big. He loves to give credit. In fact, Amazon Prime was an idea submitted by a junior level employee. That person received what was called the Door Desk Awards. Door desks are a big cultural icon I can explain for context if needed, but he would really highlight the wins, especially when it came from lower levels in the company to really reinforce that culture of clear direction from the top and bottom up innovation.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And so share with us the similar kind of an approach to Eric Schmidt, how he dealt with day-to-day on regular days, like his routines, his best practices, and then also how he dealt with the super highs and the super lows.
Yeah. So Eric Schmidt had a different role. Google was not his company. He was not a founder. So he was brought in as Larry and Sergey described him in the press release, parental supervision. And so he came in because he had the experience that Larry and Sergey did not. They had the vision, they had the technical expertise, they needed his best practices. So he approached his meetings very differently. And I think it was such an art. I have never seen anyone do it so masterfully. I would describe his leadership style as professorial. So he would come into a meeting and he would sit kind of leaned back in his chair, taking in all the information. Larry and Sergey were beautiful because they would often intellectually debate things far longer than normal people would. They take it way to the extremes. And Eric was the perfect balance of bringing them in, honing the parts of the debate that were really resonating, that needed to be resolved. And he would then come and bring it to a conclusion and get consensus. My tip here that I've never seen anyone else do, and it's terrifying, is he would then, as he was about to declare the summary of the conversation and what he thinks we need to do moving forward, he would then call on the quietest person in the room. This is terrifying to the quietest person in the room because they are almost always the junior most person in the room. He is a big believer in if you're in the room, you're here to speak. And if you didn't speak, you're not coming back next time, you weren't necessary. So he would call on the quietest voices, one, because they often had a different take on it. Often they were the novice. They weren't burdened by the way that things have always been done. So they might ask a clarifying question that really brings us to a new solution, or they might have a recommendation because they don't know how things have always been done, so they can be really creative. So that was a habit of being in a meeting with Eric. He'd be quiet, respectful, encourage debate, pull out the salient points, call on the quietest person in the room, and then he would be the one who would summarize it and be like, here's what I'm hearing, here's the next steps.
Got it. Any other Eric Schmidt, routine schedules, morning to evening, anything else that he did to kind of take all these like big strategic, best practices he talks about and make sure that he operationalizes them day to day?
He too was a voracious reader. He read a lot in the mornings. So that was similar to Jeff. He would come in. In fact, when I flew with him on his plane, I would always clear the space in between our seats because he was always literally throwing articles at me, throwing a book at me, throwing a magazine, throwing a newspaper thing that he just read. And then he had this habit, which I actually love and hadn't thought of it until this moment you asked me this question, but he not only would throw it to me because I was physically next to him all the time, but he would email these things to people with no context, no subject line, just a link to something. He liked to see what they would reply back. Some people would write a huge essay. Some people would debate it. Some people would be like, interesting, thanks for sharing, because he liked to gather different reactions. And he was also looking for who leans into it, who asks the interesting questions, who has a different take on this than I've ever heard before. And he uses the scattershot approach, is a shotgun approach of sending it out to as many places as possible and then seeing what kind of reactions come in. I love that. I've never seen anyone else do that. It can get really a little frustrating because sometimes I spent a lot of time writing something back and then someone else would write something and he'd be like, oh, well, this guy's going to own that project now. And I'd be like, dang it. I didn't, it created this great reward system for being a creative responder. So insatiable curiosity. He also would talk to everyone. The intern in the hallway could challenge him on an idea. He had an open door policy. We had office hours. Anyone could come. He sought out the greatest minds in the world in areas of expertise that aren't his. I would regularly host, either at the end of the day or at lunch or something, some authority figure in it, a subject he knew nothing about. So he might have lunch with a Nobel Prize winning scientist or with a playwright that day, just to keep him outside his comfort zone. He never wanted to be the smartest person in the room. And that's, a challenge. I always wanted to keep him stimulated in a new way, which was fun.
With the common theme here, when it comes to like reading a lot, meeting all kinds of people to learn from, but also calling on the quietest person, really trying to understand what other people are thinking. Also Jeff's, the 6-page memos, like really getting into people's heads. It all comes to this, like, I guess, I mean, we didn't say it quite so clear, but like some element of like hyper commitment to listening and really understanding what other people are thinking, how are they thinking to inform their decisions. So it's not just learning for learning's sake, but like to actually learn from everyone. And yeah, like almost like believing in the wisdom of if you listen enough,
Yeah.
you're more likely to make the right decisions,
I
as
think
opposed to really obsessing about coming up with the solution yourself.
that's so well said. I think that's exactly what's at the heart of a lot of these best practices they have, is they take it one step further than normal people do. They ask one more question, or they challenge one more level of assumptions. And a lot of people get frustrated because they're like, where are you going with this? And often they don't have an agenda. They're just curious. They want to reach out to that next level. And so taking it one step further allowed them to get the best of their teams. Yeah.
Brilliant. And just in a quick nutshell, Eric Schmidt, when it came to catastrophes and huge celebrations, how did he deal with it and what can we learn from that?
Jeff is loud and Eric is soft. So Eric is much more, he would stand up there kind of like your caring parent and be like, here's what I've observed. These are the ways in which that is unacceptable and will never happen again. Like, you're still shaking in your boots. If Eric is upset with you, you still are, but the delivery is completely different. And then he owns it. He will say, but the buck stops with me. This is on me. And here's what I hear from you. And this is what we're going to do about it. And so you never felt purely singled out. Now, of course, there were people who were fired, people who made unforgivable mistakes that needed to move away from the organization. But those conversations were always very supportive. Here's what I see from you. This is why this is no longer a fit for you, or this is why this will never happen again. And you were much more kind of guided through the process, where at the end of the meeting, the two of you were on the exact same page, even if it was bad news for you. And I think that's another really important element of the worst days ever. He's the one standing on the stage saying and taking ownership and saying, you know, this launch or this investment or this bet that I made was wrong. Here's what I've seen, and this is why I will never do it. This will never happen again. So he's modeling the behavior that he wants to see from you as well.
All right, excellent. So just want to ask you, now that we've taken a look at, the big picture strategic things and then the tactical day-to-day things that an individual does, share with us also a little bit more about, what were the tactics that they employed that were more structural in nature. What were the policies they put into place that we haven't yet mentioned that then ensured that other people, really conducted themselves in a certain way, right? Because it's nature and nurture. So some people are going to be wired in certain of these qualities. But how did they basically lead in their absence? Like, how did they set up structures such that even when they weren't in the room, people were still conducting themselves in a way where it maximized the impact for themselves and for the organization?
Such an important question. So the first reaction I think of is an example from Jeff Bezos. So just at the point when I joined the company in 2002 was the moment when he realized he could no longer be in every room where critical company decisions are being made. So he needed to replicate himself. He did that in two amazing ways, highly effective ways. The first was doing something that I have never seen anyone else do, which is he created a role called the shadow. The shadow has actually been in the news, so some of you might have heard of this recently, but the original shadow was Andy Jassy, who has just been named Jeff's successor as CEO of Amazon. Andy Jassy is the very first shadow ever. His job was very difficult. The first element of his job was to be at Jeff's side at all times, copied on every email, in every meeting, on every flight, so that person, the shadow, always had the full context of the CEO. That gave Jeff an intellectual partner that had all the context that he did. And the second part of the shadow's job, once they were up to speed, was the most terrifying and most important, which was their job was to challenge all of his ideas, poke holes in all his favorite ideas, make sure that they were keeping him accountable, on his toes, that he was never getting complacent. He called this avoiding the dreaded day two. Day one is when you're really young and you're scrappy and you don't know what you're doing, and you don't know what you're doing. And so you're just gathering all the data you can to prove your assumptions. Dreaded day two is when we get complacent, we get lazy, we assume that the model, it's going to continue to work the way it always has. So he wanted someone's full-time job to be disrupting him and challenging his ideas. So that was one practice. The second was he assigned several of his SVPs to design what are now the famous Amazon leadership principles. The leadership principles are how you institutionalize the way that Jeff thinks. How are we going to prioritize when we're choosing between this good and this good, or making a bet between this one and this one when they seem equal, what wins? And he institutionalized that decision making. Back in 2002, there were 10 original. Now there are 16. But the 10 original, I still have memorized, not because anyone ever asked me to memorize it, but because they were referenced constantly in our meetings, constantly when we're making decisions. And so everyone was making decisions according to the same playbook. So those are two things that Jeff Bezos did to replicate his mind in as many rooms and as possible, and through all levels of the company.
Right. So just the underlying theme, in whichever way we look to pursue this, one is who can really challenge you. Like, it's literally their job, and they can only truly fully challenge you if they really understand the context. So is there somebody like that? Not all of us can have a full-time person doing that, but still it's the difference between having anyone at all versus somebody. And then the second one is, in your absence, what are the ways in which people are directing their attention? Well, leadership principles can help with that. What about Eric Schmidt? Was there any organizational structures he set up such that even in his absence, people did the things that Eric would want them to do to ensure that the organization was moving in the right direction?
Eric used his staff in a slightly different way, but to the same end. So I would, with his SVPs and with his most critical meetings, I would go first. I would have the pre-meeting with the SVP. We would go through the agenda. I could be that mind reader. I knew exactly what Eric was going to ask, what data was missing, and make sure that the time wasn't wasted. I would then be able to group similar things. This goes back to that tip about making sure you stay in a single gear during a day. If we're having very data-driven decision-making where we're forward-looking and we're making some big bets, we did all of those on the same day. I would gather kind of the creative things or the hiring or those on a similar day. But because I had done all the pre-meetings and I'd made sure that everything he needed to make an educated decision was already there, those meetings were fast and his time was really well spent. And that also cleared his calendar so that it wasn't wasted in weather reports. It was just what needs to be heavily debated with Eric himself, and everything else was delegated. That was a common best practice. And it also trained up, if we had a new presenter, they learned very specifically how to present to him and how to make decisions on his way. So it became a school of how to run their meetings with their staff. Like, oh, if this is what Eric's doing, and they see the benefit of it, they would then use that practice in their own.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. And so what I want to do now is let's take everything that you shared with us, all the guidance, to one side. Inevitably, some people might be thinking, well, if I was the CEO of Google, if I were the founder of Amazon, sure, I too would do some of these things. But hey, this is the organization I run, or, I'm not necessarily the top person in charge of my company, so I just don't have as much flexibility. Share with us how, because, Jeff Bezos used to, work at a hedge fund, right?
Yep.
Eric Schmidt, wasn't always the CEO of Google, but they somehow found their way into these roles. So tell us about how to, I guess, also marry your own personal purpose and passion with the role that you're growing into, or you might eventually get. So for those who say, well, I run a company, but, there's like a gap between the kind of role I want to have versus where I'm at right now, based on maybe even your ability to delegate given who is on your team right now, or maybe because you're just like you feel like you're not senior enough yet to be able to implement these kinds of approaches. Share with us that approach to, I guess, setting a vision and aligning it with something that you're truly passionate about. It aligns with your purpose so that you can navigate ever closer to having the kind of role that you want to have.
I am really glad that you framed this question around your personal mission and values. This is always where I end up having to start with my consulting clients, because while they think they've got this other very sophisticated, unrelated problem, it always comes back to that core center. Do you know your North Star? And is it clearly defined? And I'm not talking for your company. All my CEO clients are like, oh, no, the mission statement of my company. I was like, I'm not interested in that. What I mean is you individually. What expertise do you want to be known for? What tribe are you leading? Who are you serving? And what about that is unique to you? Like, what does success look like? If you can't answer, so many CEOs can't answer the question to me of like, what does success look like? And I often frame this around, what is your living legacy? And people react to them being like, I'm not close to retiring. It has nothing to do with retiring. Your living legacy is the way that you're spending your time, your resources, your energy, and your talents today. So I really recommend writing a personal vision, mission, and value statement for yourself that guides your career. I then encourage you to do, this is hard, it's going to sound easy, but it's actually really challenging to do well. Use Pareto's principle in as many ways as you possibly can. Pareto's principle is the 80-20 rule. We're getting 80% of the results from 20% of the effort or resources. So that is, go to your calendar. Does your calendar reflect your values? Does your calendar reflect the expertise that you want to be developing, the reputation you want to have, and the impact you want to have on the world? Look at your finances, how you're spending in your company. Is that tied to your values? Look at the way you're hiring. 20% of your workforce is giving you 80% of those results. I guarantee those 20% are people who are massively passion and value aligned with you. So look at your hiring practices. What questions are we asking in candidates? And then how are we evaluating, incentivizing, and rewarding those who exhibit those behaviors once they're inside? I think that, while it sounds simple, ta-da, I just gave you the answer, is really hard to do expertly every single day and stay consistent with it. So that's another reason why that open reflection time is so important to keep yourself accountable.
But just anecdotally, from your clients or the people that you're familiar with, when you first meet them, how many of them actually have a clear mission, vision, and values? Like what percent has those super clear, such that you sit with them and they're like, yep, this is it, already thought about it?
Less than 10%. Less
Okay.
than, really. They think they do, and then when we walk through it, it all falls apart immediately. So I think that's another good way of creating an accountability system, whether you do that as a leadership team, which I think is a great exercise, and I do on the leadership offsites that I host. It creates an accountability system, and also it's a nice building camaraderie, because ideally you're all going to have a lot of commonalities in your value systems. But if you aren't yet ready to do that, do it with a partner, do it with a trusted colleague, someone who's known you a long time, or an accountability coach. But I think saying it out loud and having to defend it, each individual word, and make sure that it's fleshed out, is actually really hard. And most people have not put in that thought work, because this is not an exercise you do in a single sitting. This is something you draft, come back to, draft, come back to, and continue to hone. This isn't, I'm sorry, it's not a 15-minute exercise. Yeah.
All right, so tell us, let's spend another minute on this. So mission, vision, values. You also gave a bunch of like really great prompts, like what do you want to be known for? What tribe are you leading? What's unique to you? What's success to you? Your living legacy. Tell us, like, what's the output here? So like very specifically, you know, is it one page for each? Is it a certain number of bullet points? Are these the questions? Are there any other questions? So let's say there was a limited amount of time to come up with the first draft. And let's say we are going to do it with family or with leadership, with our colleagues and so on. What would you say is like a minimum viable way of doing this? Like, hey, spend this much time answering these questions. This is what the first draft should look like. And then, of course, it's probably a lifetime journey to keep refining it as you go. But to have that strong Pareto, like, you know, 80-20 rule, this gets me 80% of the way there, and I'm going to keep refining the next 20%. What's the best way in which we can crystallize this for those of us who don't yet have this?
I would do a first session with just yourself, where you really reflect on, who am I serving? What change do I want to make in the world? What expertise am I building? And what do I want to be known for? I feel like there's a fifth question I usually ask, but it's not coming to mind right now. But write it down for yourself and be as specific as possible. At the end of this session, where you've kind of really looked inside, if you've done it right, it's probably an exhausting process. At the end of that session, the way you can test, is this an effective statement? Is, will this inform my decision-making going forward? Will I come back to this statement in order to challenge my ideas, or especially when you're choosing between good and good? It's so easy to choose between good and bad, but will this statement help me choose which risk I'm going to take, which avenue I'm going to take? So that's a great first step. Once you feel like you have a workable draft, and 3 points that you want to look for is it specific? Is it measurable? And are all the terms defined? So if it helps you make decisions because it's specific, time-bound, and measurable, then you've got a good, effective statement, because nobody needs a slogan on their wall or on their letterhead or whatever. This is, how are we making decisions and how am I going to replicate this across my company? Then take it to somebody ideally outside of your industry and be like, what about this is unclear? Like, what term is not defined? How would you measure it? If you were my accountability coach, would you be able to hold me to account? Do we have a clearly defined definition of success? Then you've got a good thing that I would then take internally and be like, hey, I want to make my decisions as a leader, as an exec, in my career, in our collaborations, using this as our guidepost. What do you think? Those are the 3 stages I usually start with.
And you call these statements, so what does it look like? Is a mission statement, a sentence, a paragraph? What about the vision statement and then the values? Would you recommend like having 3 to 8, or like what have you found to be best practice there?
So I think the mission and value statement should be single sentences. As a way to help you dissect it, my individual mission statement for me, myself, not my company, but me, myself as a leader, is I want to discover and empower underrepresented entrepreneurs through actionable education and mentorship. That single sentence took me months and actually the first word is the last one I added, because it was originally to empower underrepresented entrepreneurs. But I realized that in order to empower them, I had to find them, because a lot of times they hadn't self-identified that way yet. So I added discover and empower. And then, so that's who I'm serving, that's what I'm serving up, and how I'm going to do it. I know, and that informs how I'm going to spend my time, what meetings I take, what invitations I accept, which ones I decline. I'm using that to inform how is that going to translate onto my calendar and where I put my resources. Most valuable resources are time, so that's why I usually start with calendars. So that's a good place to start. Single sentence for mission and vision. Then your values, I find a list of probably not more than 10 to start with, because it's clarity comes through constraint on this one, I think. And if you let yourself write 25, they lose all meaning. So really challenge yourself to start with the core 5. Inevitably, it gets to about 7 or 8, and then you're like, okay, that feels right.
Okay, perfect. I think for all of us, it's binary, right? We either have these or not.
Right.
And then if we do have them, they're actually actionable, so they can actually make us help us make decisions, or they don't. And if we don't have them or they're not actionable, then we got to really spend the time. And ultimately, what we're solving for here is not like a book on our life vision. It's really, we're talking about 2 sentences and 5 to 8 kind of values. But obviously, especially when there's conflict in our life, like between 2 good things where it's not clear, sometimes things that might feel like, well, is this in my focus or not? Well, your mission, vision, and values can help you decide that. So thank you, Anne. We'll all endeavor to have something as clear as what you shared with us for your own one. We talked so much about, the positive things that, these like Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt did to bring the best out of themselves and their teams. Let's spend just a couple minutes about really their failures and weaknesses. And this is not to bash them, obviously, right? It's just to learn. But sometimes it's so easy to think like, okay, great. So Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt, you're literally talking about the 2 people who like seem indestructible, right? Like in their ability to succeed. So share with us also like things about them that made them superhuman, and in a way to kind of give us the idea that like they did this despite things that really didn't work in their favor, to really help us maybe embrace our weaknesses. And I'm a huge believer, actually, our weaknesses are what we end up working on the most. That can actually lead to a lot of our best qualities. So just curious to maybe just level set everyone that these weren't just superheroes that could do no wrong. What were the weaknesses that maybe also then led to some of their strengths?
I'm really glad that we've circled back to this, because I do think it's important that it doesn't come across as hero worship. I know their best practices as well as I know their weaknesses, and have seen them grow despite or maybe because of those early weaknesses. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to answer Eric's with an answer that he often gives when he's asked, especially as he was starting to look to retirement at Google. He got the question a lot of like, what is your biggest regret? What is the biggest mistake that still haunts you? And this is one that I think every single one of you are going to nod your head being like, yeah, I've done that. Is he said he broke the well-established rule that we all know of hire slow, fire fast. The biggest mistakes that snowballed outside of his control was when he kept a project or a person on too long, even when he knew it wasn't working. And he did so for good reasons, because he's a kind person. He did it because he wanted to give it another chance. He didn't want to disappoint. We all are susceptible to foregone costs. There's already been so much time or so much invested here. Let's just give it one more shot. Let's squeeze whatever we can. And that led to his biggest regrets. He was very, very open with the fact that if he kept a person on too long that wasn't right for the fit or wasn't able to keep up with the growth scale of the company, the kindest thing you can do is have that conversation early and coach that person out of it, either out of that role or out of the company, because then you're setting them up for their greatest success somewhere else. And inevitably, when he didn't address the person, then it became a product or a policy or a cultural issue. And so nip it in the bud as much as you can, especially you kind-hearted CEOs who care so much, especially for your loyal employees who are there with you in the trenches when you were a nothing 5-person company. There's ways to be loyal to them that don't set both of you up for failure. So have those conversations early. Let's see, for Jeff, I'm gonna have to think about that one, not because there aren't options. I think if I had to pick one, it is because he is such an intimidating character and was from the beginning. He's so confident. He was born with supreme intelligence that he's used to defending his ideas. For example, in high school, in his valedictorian speech, he told his classmates he was going to space. Not that he wanted to, that he was going to, and he did. So this is the kind of person we're dealing with. To be in a room with him, he can intimidate, even though he's designed his teams against that weakness of his. He's tried to compensate for it. Let me tell you, some very accomplished people, despite his culture of pushback and, challenging his ideas, he sometimes doesn't insert that, he doesn't back off as early enough as he should. And that's when his other execs have to keep him to account and be like, Jeff, I think you're dominating the conversation, or I think you're not letting them speak or hearing it out because you're so sure of your direction. So he set up some systems to design around it because he knows that's his greatest weakness. He's supremely talented and he can be very intimidating.
Oh, yeah. So again, that, brings back that everything else you shared about the shadow and everything like that. So knowing that if you're too overbearing, which many founders, CEOs, or people who are in senior leadership track, they got there for a reason, then how do you make sure what got you there doesn't actually hold you back from going further? And I cannot thank you enough. This was absolutely invaluable in so many ways. So much to reflect on, at least a dozen actionable insights we can all dive into. To help us wrap up, I'd love to ask you how all of us here can best support you on your journey. How can we show our gratitude by supporting you? How can we best engage with you? And after sharing that, if you have a final word of wisdom for us or a call to action, we'd love to wrap up with that.
Thank you, Barry. This has been so much fun. And I think we all know that in teaching or in answering it, you actually learn the most because it clarifies some of your learning. So thank you. I've had several connection moments that haven't happened before. I appreciate your thoughtful questions. The best way to connect with me, I'm very active on social media, especially Twitter and LinkedIn. So because this has been a one-way conversation, I'd love to hear your reactions, your questions, maybe some of the things that happen after you try some of these best practices. Please continue the conversation there. I would love support on the book. It's called Bet on Yourself. It's for any ambitious individual of any career stage. And so the website for the book is betonyourselfbook.com. I have a lot of resources for your employees of any stage. And I also offer leadership offsites and trainings for your management teams and speaking to companies. So I would love if this resonates with you and if this really hits the nail on the head for some of your goals to continue and dive in specifically to address some of your growth goals. That would really mean a lot to me.
Brilliant. Final word of wisdom or call to action that you want to leave us with?
My call to action is whatever that was that's stuck in your brain that you wrote down, do it right now. Start right now. Don't wait for tomorrow. You're going to get distracted. Do it right now.
Brilliant. Or at least put it in your calendar to do it when you're going to do it. And can't thank you enough. All the best on the next steps. Congratulations on the book. And can't wait to meet you in person.
Thank you, Barry. This is really fun.
All the best. Take care. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Till next time, everybody will be well. And we'll see you again soon. Bye. See you, Anne.
Bye.